Jana is running this thing from her two computers upstairs, two stories above me, and so she's the one that will be monitoring your questions on the chat. You can ask questions, and then she'll mention them to us, any three of us or her, and we'll answer them as we go through talking about Barbera and so forth. Okay.
Well, I'm going to answer the first thing I read here to Maddie. He's drinking 16 Reserve Barbera, and that's exactly what's in my glass.
Great.
And it's fabulous. Bad news is we're running out of it. So,
Brian, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Scott. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Brian Oberhauser. Some call me chef. I happen to have a degree, but I've been involved now with Scott Harvey for on a full-time basis for about 6 months. But I've been loving his wines for about 20 years, so it's about time. So I've got the title of hospitality director, so it's my job to make sure when you do come to visit us, which I pray that it's very soon, that you'll have a fantastic experience. Cheers to everybody out there.
And so as we go through these wines, Brian's going to tell you what goes best with them food-wise and what's been so successful for him with each one of these wines. Molly is the assistant winemaker at the winery. She has a degree in winemaking or enology from Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, one of the first graduating classes from there, has worked in South Africa and also Australia or New Zealand?
New Zealand.
New Zealand.
Yeah.
And we cannot run the winery without her. She's fabulous. And it's been 5 years now working with Molly, and what you're tasting in the glass shows her dedication to this winemaking. So go ahead, Molly.
Yeah, like Scott said, I'm the assistant winemaker. I've been here for 5 years now, and tonight I'm drinking the 2019 Rosé Barbera. I jumped down the hill down to Roseville for the evening, so it's a little warm, so a nice chilled rosé is right up my alley for what I want to be drinking pretty much all the time, but especially right now as it's starting to get warmer and sitting out on the patio, which I will probably do after we finish this up, is go enjoy the sunset out on the back patio. But yeah, I'm a big fan of crisp, clean wines, wines that have really good acidity. It's part of what I love about Barbera, and I'm excited to get to talk about Barbera for the next hour or so.
Great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, as we're sheltering in place, and which means SIP, sipping lots of wine other than sheltering in place, but sipping wine while sheltering in place. And why Amador County, why Barbera, and why they're so good together. And then Molly's going to come back in and talk about the first wine, which is the rosé, and how rosé is made and so forth. Amador County, I think, is the best place in the world to drink, or to drink it, as well as to make Barbera. And the reason is that it comes from a very similar place in Europe. It comes from a place called Piedmonte, which in Italian means foothill. And it's a region in northwestern Italy, which is the foothills of a very fast, young growing mountain range, the Alps. And when you think of it, Amador County is the same thing. We're in the foothills of another very fast, young growing mountain range, the Sierra Nevada. And both the Alps and the Sierras are huge granite monolithic uplift due to continental drift. And they have the same decomposed granite soils coming off the sides of them. The difference is Piedmont's very close to a marine influence. So up over Genoa into the Piedmonte, you get all this fog during the growing season. Just like Monterey gets in California, or Sonoma, the coastal areas of California. And that the best variety in the Piedmont is named after that fog. It's called Nebbiolo, and it produces the best or the most expensive wines of the Piedmont. Barolo, Barbaresco, I mean, the wines that generate the most money per hectare or per acre of land. So it's the most widely planted and it gets the best vineyard sites of the Piedmont. Barbera, on the other hand, is a sun-loving variety. So in the Piedmont, it's always been treated as a secondary variety. It's been used for making frizzante and quick drinking wine, bottled quickly after harvest and so forth. And it wasn't until Darrell Cordy, a wine merchant in Sacramento, who introduced Barbera that I helped make as an apprentice at Montevina Winery in 1974 to a guy, one of probably the premier Chianti producer in Italy, Piero Antinori. And Antinori back in 76 was looking around California to invest, and he did invest in the Atlas Peak area, Napa Valley. And Darrell was showing him around, and at dinner one night, and Piero had his winemaker with him, he served that 1974 Montevina Barbera. And the next morning, Darrell was having breakfast with Piero, and Darrell goes, "Well, how'd it go?" And he said, and Piero says, "You pissed off my winemaker," and he's really mad. And Darrell goes, "Well, why?" And he goes, "Well, he tasted that Amador County Barbera, and he knows, because he was a Piedmontese, he goes, he knows he has to go back to Italy now and make serious red wine out of Barbera, and he does not want to." And so he, you know, because his love was Nebbiolo. So that's when Piemonte kicked into gear, and the area of Alba and Asti both started producing really spectacular Barberas. And I think they're very good, and they have their place, obviously. But Amador has its place because it's different, because of the sun. We just get more sun. And I'll tell you, I've tried to grow Nebbiolo here, and it's worthless. I mean, it's just like, it's like rosé, because we don't have any fog. What happens is that coastal breezes come in, they hit Monterey, the coastal mountains, and then the fog dissipates. And by the time that cool air gets to us, which is usually around 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there's no moisture left in it. So we get the benefit of the coolness, but we don't get the fog. So Barbera just explodes here. And when you think of it, you have the highest acidity Barbera is probably the Asti, very lean, very austere, really crisp, great, as Brian will be able to tell you, with dishes that really need a lot of acidity, dishes that have a lot of fat in them, so it cleanses your palate. The next austere level would be Alba, or acidic level, and then Amador Barbera. So Amador, it brings Barbera into that richer, more complete wine category of a red, luscious red wine that still has plenty of acidity and low enough pH to really go well with food. So that's why I've been preaching Barbera since 1974 when I was first introduced to making it here in Amador County. At that time, nobody knew what it was. And today I'm still preaching it, and and I got plenty of it right behind me here in the cellar. So I'll be enjoying it tonight and forever, because I'll keep making it. So with that, we have 5 Barberas we're going to go through. The first one's Rosé. The second one is this Mountain Selection. The third one is our JNS Reserve. And let's see if we can, it's kind of hard. Molly's got a better shot of it. I've got too much glare. The third one is the Toy, which is the wine I'm drinking, which looks just like the JNS Reserve, except for it has Toy written on it. And then the fourth is our Catedrale, which is our very top end Barbera, that's very limited and actually way too expensive. But being a winemaker, I don't like to pay that much money for wine, but I do like making it. So anyway, Molly, why don't you start with rosé?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Scott said, Barbera lends itself to really nice acidity, and that's something that we look for when we're making all of our wines, but particularly in our whites and rosés. We want a really crisp, clean, bright wine. And so we actually harvest this particular lot of Barbera specifically to make our rosé. A lot of times in rosé production, what winemakers will do is they'll start by making their red wine, their red, whatever varietal it is. For us, it would be Barbera. And then as they put it into the fermentation tank or whatever vessel they're going to be fermenting in, they then pull off some of that juice and they ferment that juice. And that does a couple of things. It actually brings in usually a higher sugar level, because red wines you typically ferment from a higher sugar level than white wines. We use a calculation to determine what alcohol percentage we're going to get out of a certain level of sugar. And so we harvest our whites and our rosés at a lower sugar level because we want them to sit at a really crisp and drinkable level. I believe this rosé is about 11%, 10.5% alcohol. So it's super drinkable and really nice and light. When you start getting into those high alcohol rosés, they tend to be a little bit more astringent. They tend to be a little bit rougher on the palate. So for us, we like this cleaner version, which we actually treat it like it is a white wine. And the big difference in the white wine production versus the red wine production for us, there's two. One of them is that we press off our rosé and our white wines first. So we actually bring in the fruit and we press it immediately. And that gives us that light juice. It gives us really nice clean flavors, and we don't get that super extractiveness that you can get out of letting a wine ferment before you press, which is what we do with our red wines. And so you can see in the bottle here how light in color this is. It's not a super dark magenta rosé. It's a really nice peachy pink tone, which is the tone that we look for in color. And then we age this for our rosés and our whites. We tend to age about 6 months, maybe a little bit less, depending on when we have our bottlings. But we age in stainless steel for our whites and our rosés, so they don't see any oak. They don't usually see any malolactic fermentation, which is a secondary fermentation that brings creaminess to wine, and it can lead to certain flavor profiles. I'm sure most of you have had a real buttery Chardonnay, and that's a Chardonnay that's gone through the malolactic process. And so we like to keep our whites as crisp as we can if possible, and our rosé definitely does that. We get really nice notes of kind of peach and watermelon. I happen to love those flavor profiles. We get a little bit of tropical note in there, which is just, it's fun to drink. It's fun to smell. And it's one of the things that we do is we smell our wines constantly. You'll see as we're on this video that we're constantly smelling and seeing how those aromas change. And aroma is such a huge part of our winemaking decisions. It's about 90% of the choices we make based on aromas for what we're smelling. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about our red wine process in a little bit, and our blending that we may do and different things like that. But that's our rosé in a nutshell.
So one of the questions that came up on the board that I saw, I don't know if Molly you saw it, but what bricks do we pick at? The conversion rate of percent sugar to alcohol is about 55%. So if we got a 10.5% to 11% alcohol wine, that means we're picking at about 18 to 19 bricks. Red wine is generally picked at closer to 24 to 26 bricks. So that just shows you that how much lower sugar, the fruit just has more of those brighter, a little bit of a greener, but fresher tones, fresh fruit character. than the more on the red wine, where you're going to get more of a riper fruit and more going towards plum. Which if you get to plum, it tends to be a little overripe. But so we'll go on to the next wine. So do you have anything more you want to add, Molly, to that?
Just on that same note, one of my descriptors that I use for this wine is if you're eating a strawberry and you've ever eaten when a strawberry is not ripe all the way and you get to that white part of the strawberry, it's that flavor where it's still that really pretty fruit, but there's that nice tartness and that really clean flavor that's just I really love.
And a young wine, we should also give a shout out to a young man whose birthday today, Brian Miller. I have that on my sheet here. So hey, Brian, I know you're watching. Happy birthday!
Happy birthday!
Yeah. So Brian, what about the food for this wine?
Well, Scott, that's like opening Pandora's box. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody on this panel eats every day. So for me to get up here and tell you exactly that I have the answer to all the pairings is ridiculous. But what I will share from what I haven't really talked about is my background. I come from a background where I had a mother who was a fabulous cook. And so as a young boy, I was influenced by somebody who took some time in the kitchen. And of course, there was always wine on the table. I always noticed both my mom and dad drinking wine. I think I noticed it about 12 or 13 when it came. And by the way, Scott, you might laugh, but back in those days, it was Lancers and Matutes.
And you know who created and made those wines?
Yes, I do.
Dr. Richard Peterson, who's a partner in our company on our board of directors and one of my mentors.
So I had to bring that up because I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Peterson. Very impressive. He's truly one of the true unspoken rock stars of the wine world. Anyway, so I had a mother that traveled internationally with my father, and so she would come back from a country and share with us, my two older brothers, food from a different country. But what she did is she celebrated it, and she would dress up in that particular clothing of that country. And so what was happening is we were, as kids, traveling through the dinner table. And of course, they were drinking the appropriate wines. As kids, we were just thrilled to be traveling through the dining table. Having said that, it gave me a real diverse background. So when it comes to being a professional chef and finally sending myself to Europe and doing super extensive training in both Burgundy and Paris, I ended up with an opinion. I ended up with an opinion how to do it, and I ended up with an opinion what was right. So I came back and opened a high-profile restaurant in Lake Tahoe, and I spent about a year making foods that I believed were foods that people should eat. After a year, I talked to my accountant. She said, you might want to start making food that people want to eat, not just what you want to make. And that was a big moment in my life where I realized this is such a subjective business we're in. It is extremely subjective. And so you really have to wrap this with kid gloves and say, even things that don't necessarily meet all the criteria for proper pairing doesn't mean you're going to have a bad glass of wine. It doesn't mean you're going to have a bad meal. What we're talking about here is something a little more elevated, something a little more interesting. And once we can expose you to these layers of flavors that get produced when wine is brought together with food, you will just have a journey that is very, very fun. And so we want to share that with you. And so it's hard to do it over a computer, but having said that, certainly we'll look forward to seeing you later in the year when everything's good. So the first thing I have to say about the food is Scott and Molly as well. If you notice Molly's descriptor of talking about the white flesh of a strawberry matching up with the rosé, that is something to behold. That moment of tasting that And when your brain connects to that fruit, and that white flesh of the fruit, I promise you, you'll have a great experience. That's when people get hooked on food and wine. And same thing with Scott. He mentioned, he talked about acidity. And acidity plays an incredibly important role in how food and wine organize themselves and become cohesive. But better than that, they become complementary, or sometimes they can be contrasting. But what happens in your mouth is the journey. So each of those things is very different. And so I talk about contrasting, pairings being much more dangerous, much more difficult, and then complementary pairings being generally more successful. But what we're really talking about is more like chemistry. Scott's a chemist. When I came and joined Scott, I had worked with a bunch of really world-class winemakers. But what I really found later in my career now with Scott, that he truly is making a chef's wine. That is the highest compliment I can make, because speaking amongst chefs, most of us just don't like fruit-forward wines. It limits what we can make. It limits what we can put next to the wine. So we really like wines that are more in that European style, and there's a lot of logic why that is the right thing to do. So I'm going to share with you in a screenshot my first selection, and this is one of our 3 and 3s, and this was an older, unfortunately the bottle's not in there, but this was an older vintage of Scott's Reserve Barbera, and this is, I think, one of those pairings that kind of got me. It couldn't be more simple. We call that meat and potatoes. I mean, that's about as basic as one's American diet can get. The beauty of the meat and the potatoes is, how they're done. In this particular case, classic braised beef, something more wintry, and a good comfort potato. This particular potato's got a cauliflower puree mixed into it to make it a little more vegetable. As you see, sometimes there's not a lot of green on my plate other than a little orange. But when that particular dish went up against Scott's Barbera, I had already had the wine. So I had a distinct advantage of knowing how the wine was going to react to the dish. And it is as classic and basic. So I put out to you, folks, stewed meats. That's the bottom line. Braised meats, as we call in France. Cook them a long time. Use a good liquid. Use something fortified. You got canned chicken stock or canned beef stock, put it in there and cook it long and slow. And you'll notice that all the goodness of the beef is going to end up in the stock. Hence, and you'll see this is a big reduction of that stock to the point where it gets kind of glossy. And then when you drink the wine, all of a sudden, the fats that are still present in that dish come up and dance with the acidity of the wine. That is the moment that I say is an aha moment. I've got a couple dishes we'll share with you. If any of you want the recipes, a lot of them are online, but some of them aren't. So if anybody has any interest, just email me at chefbrian@scottharveywines.com and we'll forward those recipes to you. So let's go to the next wine.
So Brian, this is for red wine, obviously. Did you have one for white wine that you would suggest, or for the rosé?
I do. I forgot about the rosé. I just, after the strawberries, after hearing about the white flesh of the strawberry, where is there else to go than that? That's like the perfect pairing right there. All right, so yeah, let's take a quick look there. Well, let me come back with it because it's okay. I'm not that technical.
I'll go on to the red wine for Brian's beef and potato dish there, which is our Mountain Selection Barbera, which you can see up here. It shows up well on my camera because of the glare isn't destroying it like with the white label. But this Mountain Selection is my go-to wine. Molly and I, we crush Barbera from a whole bunch of different vineyards, and then we get to, this is the wine where we get to play. We have 10 different vineyards all in front of us in the lab, and we get to add a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and come up with the everyday wine. I mean, a winemaker wants to make the best Van Ordinaire. Now I'm using a French term with an Italian variety and a California winery, but they just want to make the best everyday wine they can. And this is our biggest selling wine at the winery, and rightfully so, because it expresses that mountain terroir, or that mountain growing appellation of Amador County. That's why it's called Mountain Selection. So Molly, you want to talk a little bit about blending?
Yeah, so part of our process that we go through is blending. We do it all up in the lab in really small amounts, because it would be heartbreaking for us if we just decided to make a blend in the cellar and it didn't work. Then we'd have to start over and figure out where to go from there. It's much easier to do that with a 100 milliliter sample or a 50 milliliter sample and be able to start over again up in the lab. So when we get ready for a bottling, Scott and I spend usually, depending on how many wines we're bottling at the time, usually a day or two up in the lab just blending. And if you ever come to visit us during that time, you'll see we have an 8-foot table filled with glasses and bottles and all of the different wines we have in the cellar. And we go through and we make a couple of decisions ahead of time. One of them is, how much wine do we need to make? We have certain benchmarks that we look at to see what volume of wine we need to produce, how many cases of wines we need to make. And from there we look at, okay, we have, 10,000 gallons of this. We never have 10,000 gallons of anything, but that's just an easy number to use. We have 10,000 gallons of this, we have 5,000 gallons of this, and we have 2,000 gallons of this, and we need to make 7,000 gallons of something. So we then go up into the lab and we say, okay, well, if we need 7,000 gallons, let's look at what we have enough of if we want to make it a single vineyard, which we'll talk about in a little bit, like we do with the toy vineyard. But for something like the Mountain Selection, we'll say, okay, we need to make a certain amount. And so we say, well, let's just start somewhere. So we'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And like Scott said, we have, if not 10, we have close to 10 vineyards of Barbera. And so we'll take a sample, a little sample of one and a little sample of another, and we'll blend them together and smell, do a lot of smelling, because like I said, it's usually a day or two, and we can't be just sitting there drinking all of it the whole time, because we wouldn't be able to go home, at least not safely. So we smell it, and we make a lot of, like I said, we make a lot of decisions based on smell, based on aroma, and from there, we kind of whittle out the different blends that we like. And so we'll say, well, we like this, and it'll be something like it's showing a property that we don't like, or it's, we want to emphasize something a little bit more. So we'll say, okay, well, we liked this 50-50 blend. Let's try a 70-30 blend of the same vineyards and see what happens from there. And so there's this whole chain of decision making that happens at that point, where we just start going through and we keep the blends that we make, so that then we can go through and say, well, I like it more than this one, but maybe not as much as the next one. And like Brian had mentioned about being a chef and cooking food that he wants to eat, it's another decision that winemakers have to make is, do we make the wine that Scott and I want to drink, which may not necessarily be the same wine that consumers want to drink, because we are tasting unfinished wine so often that it can mess with your palate a little bit. And so we'll have to look through and make a decision of, well, here's the things that I really like as a winemaker, and here are things that I think the consumer's really going to like. And we try to find a really nice balance so that we end up with a wine that we want to be drinking and that's going to taste good to you.
The other thing is we have to use up all the wine in the cellar. Being a business owner, we made all these vineyards, so that comes into play too. And then the reserve, both the reserve, the JNS Reserve Barbera and the Mountain Selection Barbera, are both blended wines, and so they each have their own traditional style and structure, and so Molly and I blend to that. And then the most important thing is after going through 20 or 30 blends, when Molly and I find what we like, and we also allow anybody else at the winery, like Brian, our secretary is just right off the lab. She doesn't tend to want to taste, but anybody that wants to can come in and taste with us because we want their opinions as well. But when we finally have the blend that we want to bottle, then we make up bottles of it and we all take them home and we taste that wine with dinner. Jana and I, and that's the reason it is called, the next wine is called JNS Reserve. Jana and I will cook dinner together, and of course that's kind of how we relax. We really like cooking together in the evening and after all this stuff, especially when all your tasting, one day you're open and the next day the governor says all your tasting rooms are closed. It's kind of like, how do we relax? But so we cook dinner together and then we have that wine with the meal. Jana has a very good palate. Women tend to have, notice we have a woman winemaker here at the winery as well. Women tend to have better palates than men. And I really trust both Molly and Jana's palate. But Jana and I have that wine with dinner. Molly has it with dinner with her mother, in this case tonight would be. And she's down in Roseville at her mother's house. And Brian has it with his wife. And then, we get back together and say, well, it didn't work, or it did work. And if it doesn't work with the meal, then Molly and I start blending again. And so many winemakers leave their wine at the winery. They don't take it home. And I think it's real important to take that wine home and have it with food and see if it works right. So by the time we put it in the bottle and you buy it, you're going to get something that works for you.
Scott, can I jump in there and
Yeah.
play in a little bit here? We have had a lot of great sessions and tasting wine together. And I think that, that broad sense of everybody's got a different palate and everybody's tasting different things. We've got some people who are telling us what they're actually having for food today. And we've got this unbelievable, so we got some street tacos working out there. Shout out to the street tacos, always work. There's meatloaf out there today. So again, food is just, everybody's got to eat. And you look up and you say, what wine do I pick to eat? Red Label Barbera would be my pick almost every time. So.
Yeah, and one of them you noticed was Paulette having turkey.
Yeah, I saw that. I thought I was
your
like,
leftover turkey for me.
come on.
Yeah, Paulette is my daughter. It was her two boys that helped me build these wine racks, Jake and Nate. But I cooked the turkey on Sunday, and then with some creme brulee and some acorn squash from the garden, and took half of it over to their house and left it on the doorstep and came home. And so that's the turkey she's talking about.
She also said she was having gnocchi, which is one of my most favorite foods of all time. I love gnocchi, and so I'm a little jealous.
I'm with you. We all want to share. So I'm going to back up real quick and go back to the rosé. I've got a great rosé story for me personally. I grew up in a family that seemed to like fine wines as they elevated past the Lancers and the Twos. And there was this phase when I was old enough to drink wine, but too young to understand the difference. And I ran into some white Zinfandel, and I had a very bad experience, and I would not drink a blush wine until I got in the wine business, which is, we're talking 25 years later. I would not drink a blush wine. So when I went to work for Nicky Hahn up in the Santa Lucia Highlands, we did a lot of Saignée at Pinot Noir. And so I said, what is a Saignée? And that Scott can explain Saignée, but it's a process where you take the juice off and you press off and you get this first run of juice. And they would make this blush Pinot Noir, and it was delicious. So I remembered right then, I decided that the rosés are so overlooked in our industry, constantly overlooked. And as I managed their wine club, people would send their rosés of Pinot back saying, I don't even want to taste it. I'd say, you can have it for free, just taste it. And every one of them would come back and buy it. So those of you who don't drink rosé, this is one of the great wines for summer and fall. And so one of the dishes that I did back in the day, and we'll do that dish with the 3 and 3 up and coming with the rosé, is a cold cantaloupe soup with a little verbena lemon gratin. So it's a cold ice right there. And so I found that in the summer, rosés, this particular rosé is made in the classic style, it's not Saignée, lend themselves to these incredible cold preparations. And so this is a good example, again, of something a little elevated, but you could do it really simple. All you got to do is take cantaloupes and, throw them in your Cuisinart and, puree it up, and then strain the juice that comes off of it. Just put it in the strainer. Whatever comes off of it, put it in the freezer, let it get real cold, and you'll find that that is, for me, the perfect pairing with rosé.
Yeah, I made a lot of rosé. Americans are rosé drinkers. They just don't know it. But I made a ton of rosé back in the 80s for a winery called Santino. And we called our wine, our rosé, Chateau Cash Flow. And it was White Zinfandel. I didn't call it White Zinfandel. I called it White Harvest Zinfandel because the term for making rosé in Germany, where I went to winemaking school, is Weissherbst. And Weissherbst translated into English is White Harvest. So Santino White Harvest Zinfandel was made just like this Barbera rosé. It was between 9.5%, 10.5% alcohol, very crisp, very bright, and very high acidity, and just enough residual sugar to mask that acidity, where the acidity masks residual sugar counterbalancing effect, which is a trick to making rosé. But anyway, back to Barbera. Since we're a Barbera-centric winery, I'm making that same wine now out of Barbera, or Molly and I, rather than just Zinfandel. But so the next wine is our JNS Reserve. And Molly can probably put up a better picture of it because mine is glary. And we already talked a little bit about this. This is the same process as the Mountain Selection. It's just made in a leaner style, more in a European style, more where we're looking a little less fruit, but more where the wine accentuates the character of Amador, where it's really telling the story of a little bit higher acidity, lower pH. It's telling the stories of the vineyards that are blended into it. So Molly, do you have anything to say about it?
Yeah, one of the things that we do in our winemaking process is and if you drink our wines, you'll notice there's not a lot of oak profile in our wines. You don't taste a lot of oak. Cedar wood, cigar box, any of those kind of descriptors, the real smoky aromas and flavors, you don't tend to get out of our wines. And that's because we're very conscious of the oak that we use. We use all neutral oak. And so we get the benefits of aging in an oak barrel that we want, but without that heavy oak influence. And so that helps to give our wines a real sense of place, like Scott was talking about, letting the vineyards tell the story of the growing season and their environment that they're growing in. It does translate into the fruit, and that's part of how you get changes in flavors of wine year to year, is because the vintages change. This year we're having a weird winter and spring where we had almost no rain for the month of February, and then we got a ton of rain in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And so that's going to change how the fruit presents itself. And that's one of the things we like to look for with particularly with our reserve Barberas, is that sense of place where this fruit is coming from and the vintage that it came from, is really making sure that that stands alone and tells its own story.
Brian, you got a dish for it?
I do. I've got a couple of them. So, I think we'll do a little shout out to the plant-based people out there. The thing, I started with meat and potatoes, but the thing that maybe doesn't come off is I have, as like everybody else, become much more plant-based with my eating, which presents a lot more challenges for me as a culinary professional with wine. So with plants, Scott, we all know there's not a lot of fat in plants. So, we've got olive oil, so we've got those fats. We've got fat in fruit like avocados, so we can use avocado oil. But for the plant-based people, it's really an interesting quandary as they navigate through this wine and food world. And I think we've been very, very open to letting our culinary program evolve into more of a plant-based kind of thing. And so this is a simple thing, and Jana already answered them. Pasta. Well, that's all they ever hear, pasta. But have a little, take it up a notch and make a pasta dish, but take a little time. And this is very simple. It's a pasta sheet. You just cut out some sheets. The beauty of it is what's in the ravioli is all greens that Nancy bought this massive bag of greens from Costco. And they're all these, like, they call them super greens. So they're everything from collard greens, kale, and just every green known to man. I'm like, what are you going to do with all this? And eventually it got to the point where I had to do something with these greens. So I steamed them all off, pureed them, pushed all the water out of them, which you cannot believe is how much water comes out of them, and got them to a real dense mass, and just put in a little goat cheese, put a couple pieces of pasta together, a little goat cheese, and then around the outside, just any tomato sauce. You could use anything you've got in the pantry. We're shut in. You have a tomato spaghetti sauce. Use it. It would be perfect for this. So there's my plant-based pairing for the reserve. And I do have one other dish.
And Brian, for our last, was it Big Crush that we did, that you did the garden ratatouille for, that was just phenomenal?
Right. I don't have a picture of that, but that makes total sense, right?
Yeah. But that I remember that being, I definitely snuck a couple portions of that when we had it, because it's a beautiful mix of just wood-fired vegetables and a really lovely sauce with just a tiny bit of cheese on top. And it was, we paired it with I think with the Mountain Select Barbera, and it was killer. It was fantastic.
Great. So if you guys have any questions, don't be afraid to post them, and we'll try to answer them. The next one is our Vineyard Designate Barbera, which is the toy, which is what I started with. I've already switched to the Catedrale, but the Toy Vineyard is an amazing vineyard. It's the old Del Porto Vineyard, now owned by Toy. Toy actually planted this vineyard. The Del Porto owned the property that Toy bought. Del Porto was just a dear friend who I got to know when I first came to Amador County and back in '74. I actually grew up on the other side of the river. When you live in the foothills, the locals say how many river canyons. I lived 2 river canyons to the north in Diamond Springs, where I grew up, and you had the forks of the Casumis River between us. And then in Amador County here, my step grandfather lived, and so forth. But anyway, Del Porto is an old family from the California Gold Rush, and the descendants are still here today. The Dillian Winery in Amador County is actually the Del Porto family, making great wines in Amador County as well, who both brothers I worked with over time. But anyway, this Toy Vineyard is from that Del Porto family, and it's a vineyard that looks out over the whole Sacramento, San Joaquin Valley. You can see straight to Mount Diablo from this vineyard, hanging off the side of the mountain. And when Molly and I first make the wine, tastes terrible. I mean, it just has this raspy kind of stemmy, leafy kind of like dried stems, and I'm going, oh God, and I taste it and I write it in my notes and the lab books and stuff. And by the time it's sat in the barrel for a year and it's come around, that raspy stemminess develops into this really complex, layered or kind of intertwined tannin structure that just really holds the wine together and really tells the story of Amador County. And so we decided to do a vineyard designate with it. It's kind of like making Pinot Noir. I make Pinot Noir from my mentor, Dr. Richard Peterson from the Santa Lucia Highlands. And I always say Pinot Noir winemakers are great spouses, because it takes a lot of patience to make Pinot Noir, because it just goes from awful to wonderful to awful to wonderful as it's aging through its process in the winery. And this Toy Vineyard does the same thing. And I guess sometimes it's wines like that that really in the long run show the grace and the patience and the beauty of what the region can produce. But Molly, you got anything to add?
Yeah, I think this particular vineyard might be our highest elevation vineyard that we source from as far as Barbera, or at least one of them. It may be pretty close.
It's not the highest, yeah.
Yeah, but it's this beautiful little pocket. It's when you drive, if you ever drive up, it's off of Fiddletown Road, and when you drive up through that area, you're driving through this kind of oak forest. So it's a little.
Jana's come downstairs. She wants some more wine.
She's getting.
I've already opened the Catedrale.
But it's
okay,
this.
Okay, Molly. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Hey, there's always time to break for wine. But it's this beautiful little valley, this little pocket valley, and this little vineyard that just kind of peeks out from around the corner as you're driving up. And so you're driving through this kind of sparse oak forest, and it starts getting a little denser, and you come around a curve, and all of a sudden there's this idyllic little valley to the side, and that's where this vineyard sits, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And like Scott said, when we taste this fruit, when it first comes in, it makes the weirdest tasting wine, especially Barbera, because like we've mentioned a couple of times, we make a lot of Barbera. And this one always tastes real funky when we first get it. But then we're not quite sure how it happens, but something happens in that aging process that all of a sudden it turns into this beautiful, and it really brings out the herbaceous quality of Barbera. It's usually a little bit less of the fruity characters that we use to describe it, and much more in that herbaceous and earthiness that can make Barbera really, really interesting.
Brian, you got a dish for it?
I have a Toy Story.
Okay.
It sounds like a movie title.
I have 4 of them.
So when I first came to work with consulting for Scott, this is at least 2 years ago, I was really getting indoctrinated deeply with Scott's Barberas, and so a lot of red label wines, but I was just kind of busy drinking all of Scott's wines. And it wasn't until about 6 months later, I'm drinking something and I said, "What's this?" And they said, "Oh, it's Toy." And I said, "Toy? Where'd that come from?" So apparently I had not been shared for almost the first 6 months of working there. There was this special niche wine of Barbera that expressed Barbera maybe in the top level of all the Barberas in Amador. And so I tasted, and right away I was taken over by it. And said, "Well, this is, I was kind of mad. Why didn't you share this with me?" So I do know it's an extremely short supply wine. So having said that, I've had a chance to work with it for 3 vintages now, and it is expressive. It does things that the other Barberas don't. And in 2017, it certainly has done and shown well for the vineyard. So for me, I'm going to bring up a screenshot here. I want to show everybody that and this happens to be a 3 and 3, and this could easily be Toy. You don't have to think red meat. You don't have to think anything down those lines. For this event, we did a sous vide, like 2-day day boat caught halibut that was shipped into me. This halibut just smelled like the ocean. So I actually did something different. I did a sous vide thing, which I'll talk about on Friday when I do Secrets of the Chef. And that particular halibut dish really wasn't that elevated with a lot of fat, and it nailed it. And those that were here for that event said, "I've never tasted fish with a red wine like that." And that's a dish and a success, because to me, this is like one of those major aha moments where it was so successful. And then I realized you can have fish with it, particularly Barbera, which is such a great fruit component. So I wanted to share that one with you.
Great.
Fantastic.
Okay, so the 5th wine, which is our Catedrale, which is what I'm actually drinking right now. And this wine has a story in that Jana and I were at another winery in Amador County, and all of a sudden they were selling $100 Barbera. Well, Jana goes, she's sales and marketing. She goes, "We can't not have $100 Barbera, because you're the guy that's promoted Barbera all these years, you can't be outdone." I said, "Okay." So, Molly and I sat down, we went through the cellar, and we took the very, very best wine we had, which normally we use to upgrade the reserve Barbera. And created, it was only 4 barrels. So it was a small production to begin with, and set that aside and kind of gave it a little extra tender love and so forth, and created this Catedrale. Catedrale is the Italian name for cathedral. And our top in Napa Valley wine is called Cathedral because Jana and I were engaged at Cathedral Rock 24 years ago. And actually just before the shutdown or the shelter in place, we had hiked to the top of Cathedral Rock with some friends of ours who own, I think, the best restaurant in Amador County, Teresa's Restaurant, Phil and Ginny Girolani. But anyway, so we set these 4 barrels. Molly and I set these 4 barrels aside, just treated it so that it would express everything we wanted in Catedrale. Tasted it out of the barrel with Brian and special tidbits of like tapa type things, and created this Catedrale Society. And we bottled the wine, and then all of a sudden the price was $111 a bottle. And I go, what's this? Well, it's another story, which is Jana was born on 11/11, okay, at 11 o'clock. And she always wanted me to create a label called 11/11. And I go, God, we have enough SKUs. We have enough wines, we don't need another one. And so I didn't do it. And of course, somebody else did and trademarked it. And she's been pissed off about that ever since. So if she can't have a wine called 11/11, she's going to have a wine that costs $111. So that's where the $111 came from. But it is a wine worth $111, even though I have a hard time paying that for a bottle of wine myself. But if you're part of the society, it ends up being much less. And and Brian can tell you what the society offers because he created it, and it's a heck of a deal. And it is the best Barbera I've ever made, and or Molly and I have ever made. After 46 years of making Barbera, I'm just unbelievably proud of this wine and what it shows for the Amador County terroir. So Brian, you want to talk about the society, and then Molly, you can talk a little bit.
Well, I love the way you said that. It almost sounded like being all shut in here. I'm thinking, a society? I'd like to be part of a society. Now that I'm living all by myself in this house with my beautiful wife, so we don't believe that everything needs to be a wine club, because that's a great thing. You get our wines all the time, but the society level is more people with like minds, or they're really more interested in just enjoying wine, food, travel, that whole spectrum of things that don't exist anymore. I mean, the travel part's gone, getting together as a society's gone. But you know what? Scott's Catedrale still is available. That's the great news. It was by far the best wine I had tasted from Scott. It's by far the best wine from a Barbera standpoint that I've ever had, and that includes Italy. And this is just such a benchmark thing that we've done some really, really amazing things with this. So one of the things we did, those that don't know, we did a virtual tasting where we had a futures release party, and we had everybody buy their wines as futures. We finally shipped their wines, and in their box went this extremely rare spaghetti made from very rare, but it was on the planet for 1,000 years. Heritage semolina wheat that still only grows in Italy. And all they do is extrude it with water. It's the most simple concept. And this pasta, you can buy a box of pasta at Rayleigh's for $2. A 1 pound box of this was $14. So that tells you how extremely rare it was. Was it that much better? Yeah, it was probably twice as good.
I thought it was.
Yeah, but I mean, the funny thing was that was very special. So that went in their box. Their Catedrale that they had purchased 6-8 months in advance was in their box. And I believe we had our first ever virtual cooking and tasting. I've checked around. Nobody has had where they were cooking with a common ingredient like that. Pretty cool. So as societies go, I would have liked to have been part of that. And yeah, my hat's off to the Catedrale people. those of you that are out there, you know it's the most amazing wine, Barbera in America.
Molly?
Yeah, well, back to the Catadrale itself. It's something that we do treat differently, and it's not. I mean, we treat all of our wines well, but we pay special attention to these barrels, and we pay special attention to how we let this wine age, and it lends itself to a really unique kind of complexity and a really beautiful fruit character that isn't too overly fruity, but is still really nice and very balanced. It's one of the most balanced wines I think I've ever had, let alone made. My first experience with Barbera has been working with Scott, and all places that I've worked before here, we didn't grow Barbera. And I think the Catadrale is such a beautiful expression of what Amador County Barbera is and what it can be, that it's something really special. And it's always fun getting to do futures because we have events that we allow you to come and taste out of the barrel. And we let you know that it's still going to change. Wine continues to change during its aging process and during its maturation process as well. So, make sure that you know that, but it's something that's really special, and we only do it for certain wines, and the Catadrale is one. And it's a really fun thing that hopefully we'll get back to being able to do soon, that we'll be able to invite you back to the winery to be able to see some of the cool stuff we're doing in production, some of the cool stuff we're doing with the Catadrale.
So thanks, everybody. I think we're going to be wrapping it up, but I have one last question. I thought that was a great question. Of all these wines that we've been showing tonight, somebody wanted to know what is the most one that would be most indicative of Barbera if you're going to take it to like a sommelier exam.
Yeah, that's Bob. That's from Bob and Christy Nelson. And I can see the questions here on my screen.
That's not such an easy answer, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. But
that's a tricky one.
The other thing is Bob and Christy texted us today. They're dear friends, and Bob is a doctor dealing with this coronavirus thing.
Right.
And he asked us. He said, "Can you produce a wine where the sales would be a certain amount of it would be dedicated to helping us fight this, because he's on the front lines, helping the people that are fighting on the front lines." And we do have a wine. Molly and I have, Molly, I think it's 30 gallons of Cathedral that is still in bulk.
Yeah, but it's a little bit more than 30 gallons, but not much. 30 to 50. So Molly and I will bottle that up as in magnums, and then we'll offer it as a COVID-19 promotional thing for where a certain percentage of the gross sales will go to helping us get through this crisis. And so look for that. But I think for a sommelier exam, the wine that would be used would be the J&S Reserve. It is kind of the mean of all these 5 wines of what Amador can do on a daily basis, day in and out. The Catedrale is at the top end, and the Mountain Selection is the main wine. But the wine that I think would be put in a Somm exam would be the J&S Reserve. So, yeah. Yeah, especially as far as Amador County, it's a really, really good representation of Amador County Barbera as a whole. Whereas when you get higher above that, you're looking at more vineyard specific. And so it doesn't give you as broad of a picture of Amador County as the Reserve does. But I definitely agree that it's it's probably the best representation of Barbera in Amador County as a whole.
And I didn't mention Christy. Christy's a nurse, Bob's a doctor. They're both on the front lines, and they're both helping us get through this. So I'd like my hats off to both of you. One of the other questions I see is, what's the name of the restaurant Scott Harvey or Scott mentioned when he was talking about Cathedral Rock? That is Teresa's restaurant in Amador County. It's a restaurant that's been here for 100 years. The same family owns it, the Girolani family. And if you're up here and you are those people that are up here, they have takeout. Twice Jana and I have ordered from them, and for $60 we got enough food, because it's an old Italian restaurant. You know, with your chicken cacciatore or your whatever you order, always comes a salad and pasta and minestrone soup. And, you know, so we ordered two dinners and it cost $60, and we end up with enough to eat for 3 dinners, you know, for between the two of us.
That's Italian.
It's just fabulous Italian cuisine from the old times. So
Yeah, it's pretty fantastic. I've had their food before, and it's pretty wonderful, and it's great with any Barbera you'd put up against it. It's a great.
Actually, I'm going to throw in a little fun tidbit. If you go there and you sit at the bar and you ask for a reserve Barbera, the bartender literally has to go open up a floor and climb down a ladder to get the reserve. So I highly recommend ordering reserve Barbera there, because to watch him go down the ladder in the bar, that's pretty cool. You don't see that in many songs running downstairs at the bar.
So Jana, you've got a special deal for the people that are here.
Yes, as a matter of fact. So I'm hoping that not hoping, I'm sure that we made you all very thirsty for Barbera. So if you would like to order some of our 5 Barberas, just go to go to our website and put in BAR 30. That's going to give you 30% off and complimentary shipping on your Barbera order. And then we also want to mention, we hope you'll join us for some of our more virtual tastings in the coming weeks. Tomorrow at 5, we have one with Wine on 49, which is representing our 8 tasting rooms in Sutter Creek. And then we also have a show and tell with our new winery app. And then Secrets of the Winery Chef with Chef Brian. All these are available at our events page at Scott Harvey Wines. So all the registrations are there. So we're hoping in the meantime, you all stay safe, healthy, and sane. So thanks again for joining us.
Love you guys. Sip
We're
a
gonna be
lot of wine
doing-
while you're sheltering in place.
Thank you very much.
We're gonna be doing some more live videos, both here and on our social medias. We've got some stuff going on at the winery because beverage production is considered an essential agricultural process. So I'm still working. We're still doing stuff at the winery, and so we may bring you out to the cellar or bring you back up into the lab. So make sure you follow us on Facebook and Instagram, because we'll be going live there in the next couple of weeks too. And yeah, everybody stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Hopefully sooner rather than later.
Thanks, everybody.